Welcome to Power Up Podcast, the podcast that seeks to empower and dismantle, giving us the power and confidence to question, deconstruct, rebuild, and expand in life. I'm your host, Amma Rouge, voiceover and multidisciplinary artist, well-being advocate, food and book geek with over 14 years of movement-centered experience.
I am your host, Ella Mesmer, artist, choreographer, yogi and coach with a passion for alchemy, creativity, transformation and workplace wellness.
We recognise that we can't dismantle and empower or be empowered without first learning ourselves, diving deeper to unlearn the harmful, restrictive and unprogressive. It's an ongoing practice and journey for us all, which is why we created this podcast.
Our show features guests doing the work to enlighten, deconstruct and power up in their own magical ways.
We're going to be having conversations around the power of healing, transformation, well-being and creativity, and how they feed our personal and collective evolution, how they help us power up. Today we have an amazing birthday bonus episode. Power Up Podcast is 1 year old. We can't believe it.
Happy birthday to us.
Happy birthday to us. And as such, we're joined by a really, really special guest. We can't wait for you to meet her. She goes by the name of Dr. Sarah L. Webb. She's an international speaker, consultant and coach. And she launched the global initiative Colorism Healing in 2013 to raise awareness and foster healing. Dr. Webb has been featured on numerous radio and podcast shows, Fox Soul TV, the Illinois Times, and the TEDx stage. So we are super gassed to have her here with us today. You may have listened to our previous series on colorism, and we felt like it needed a deep dive in from a colorism expert. And so enter Dr. Sarah Webb.
Hello, everyone. So I'm super excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Welcome. So great to have you here. And I had the pleasure of meeting you on the wonderful Mixed Bloom Room by Sarah Lotus. And having heard you, I was like to Amma, we just have to do this. We have to make this happen. And yeah, it's such a joy to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm excited.
So let's dive in with the big question. What is colorism, Dr. Sarah Webb?
So yeah, that's a great place to start. Colorism is a system. It's a social stratification based on skin tone. And it happens within a racial group and across a racial group. And so in understanding what colorism is, it's important not to use the category of color and race as synonyms or not to use them interchangeably, but realize that people can be the same racial category or be a part of the same racial group and yet have very different skin tones. And so most people are familiar with racism, being discriminated against based on your racial classification. But colorism is being discriminated against based on what people actually see in terms of your skin tone and oftentimes your facial features or hair texture, eye color. And so the pattern across different cultures, the pattern across different places in the world is that people who have lighter skin tones or straighter hair or lighter colored eyes are privileged in the social hierarchy. And those with darker skin tones and fuller features or curlier, tightly coiled hair textures are marginalized or oppressed or disadvantaged in the social hierarchy.
And why is colorism such an important topic? Why is it something that is becoming more openly talked about? Why wasn't it talked about as much previously?
Mm-hmm. So that's a really good point. It wasn't always as widely known. There's been increasing awareness over time. I know a lot of the awareness has come because people with influence have finally started to take up the conversation in a more public way, in a more nuanced way. People have been doing academic research. So like university professors and scholars and lawyers and sociologists, economists have published research for a long time, for decades. But because it was in the academic sort of scholarly realm, it wasn't reaching the masses. And so in the age where people are able to produce content for the public through film, social media, podcasts such as this one, right? Now that the average person has better access to tools of communication, we're seeing conversations like this sort of expand and become broader and not just be limited to an academic journal or textbook. And also, it's a very difficult topic, right? In a lot of places, it's considered taboo. It can be painful to talk about it. It can be, people can be defensive or be on guard
Or
when
to
they're
be
talking about it.
dismissive.
Dismissive, right? Which is another
Yeah.
way to be defensive, right? I don't want to look at this thing, so let me shut it down or try to shut down the conversation. And so I think that was able to keep it suppressed for so long, right? Especially in families where these things happen and certain people are implicated, right? Like there are implications for many of us. Most of us at some point have probably participated in these kinds of ideologies, either knowingly or unknowingly. And so I think that sense of guilt is something that people don't want to confront, aren't willing to confront. But I think there's a need to talk about it. It's important to face the fear. It's important to overcome that defensiveness because colorism has real, tangible impacts on people's lives, right? So the research I mentioned talks about pay inequality or employment and hiring. There's discrimination in the policing systems, right? Certain people are criminalized because they have darker skin or they fit the stereotypical image of what a criminal looks like versus other people who fit the image of what an innocent quote unquote person looks like. And so we see these biases and these prejudices having like real impacts on people's lives and sometimes leading to the loss of life in extreme cases.
Yeah. And so would you say that this kind of like hierarchy of privilege is like it's in the system, right? But it's also in like the home space. Could you talk a bit more about that? Of like how do we unlearn this?
So I often talk about the concentric circles of how it manifests. And there's the individual person, right? And then there's the interpersonal. So our relationship to a family, our relationship to an intimate partner or a friend. And then there's the sort of institutional layer. So a school or a particular hospital. And then the systemic arena is like all encompassing, right? So all of these systems interworking together. And depending on our lifestyle, depending on our particular interests and skills, and just where we are in our own development, we might begin in any one of those areas, right? And so I think one of the most accessible places for people to begin is with the individual piece, right? And so the very first thing I want people to do is to reflect on whether or not you have a bias against people with darker skin tone. Harvard University has a test. They've tested thousands of people around the world, and they've been able to measure the degree to which you have a bias for or against a particular shade of skin.
Wow.
And so I took the test. I've had my students take the test over time. There are a few people who have like a really strong preference for darker skin, but of course, you know, the numbers, the average, the majority of people who take the test showed either a slight bias or a significant bias in favor of light skin, right? And so we see that that's definitely the pattern, the trend among most people. And so I think just getting honest with yourself is the first accessible step in addressing it on the individual level. It's like, do I have biases? Where have I made comments, for example? Where have I told someone to stay out of the sun? Have I ever, not considered a partner because I didn't want my children to be dark skinned, right? And so just doing that self-reflection, that's key in order to unpacking this. But for anyone who has already started doing that personal work and who's ready to like get out there in society or like influence their family, I think the second accessible thing is to start having conversations. And there are a few ways that you can enter a conversation. One way is to talk about a personal experience that you've had, right? So let's say you're talking to your mom or your friend or your partner or even a colleague at work. And you say, the other day, someone told me that I got darker, right? And I've always, wondered why people feel the need to make that comment. Have you ever heard something like that, right? And then the other thing I think is, in terms of entering these conversations, is to ask people if they've ever heard of colorism, right? Have you ever heard of this thing called colorism? I was listening to this podcast the other day. And they were talking about this thing called colorism. Have you ever heard of that, right? So I think that's another accessible way. Like, you don't have to have years of research in your background. You don't have to be an activist or a public speaker to help with this issue. You can start in the spaces where you're already comfortable and asking very broad questions and leaving it open. I think one tip in terms of avoiding, strategies to avoid, are to start preaching at people right away, especially if this is the first time the conversation has come up. And so really, I think opening up about your personal experiences helps people to let down their defenses and let down their guards. But all that said, it's still a difficult conversation, right? And so I think going into the work, people should prepare themselves for it to be uncomfortable and get comfortable being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
We talk about that a lot on this podcast, actually, about getting comfortable sitting with the uncomfortable, because that's the only way for you to move beyond, is to first do the work of actually just being in it and feeling everything that you feel in it.
Yep.
Yeah, and it's such a human kind of thing to not want to be in that place, right? Like, we do everything to just always feel good
Yeah, absolutely.
and to avoid the discomfort.
Yes.
Yeah, and so it's definitely a skill, learning to be uncomfortable.
And I'll add to that in terms of learning to be uncomfortable, because everything is uncomfortable, right? Like, so I was talking yesterday on my live about escapism, and solving the problem is uncomfortable, but
Right.
not solving the problem is also uncomfortable, right? Like, so you're
Yeah.
basically choosing like which version of discomfort you're going to settle for, right? And I think going through the discomfort of solving problems or facing problems, there's a better payout, right? Because eventually you can hope that the
Yeah.
discomfort will end or dissipate at some point. But I think ignoring a problem, like if you're just stuck with a problem and you're just like, okay, I'm just going to ignore it, like the discomfort is only going to grow over time, right?
Yes. I was with my nephews yesterday, and they're both very different shades, and they both have very different hair texture, and they both have the same parents, and I just watch them playing, and I often think, my gosh, is he going to be treated more unfairly than him, purely because he's a darker shade and he has a tighter curl? And it's already something that, I'm like, oh God, I really hope not, really hope that actually they're both just taken on their merit, and they're both wonderful boys and they're wonderful humans already, and I would just love people to see that and to really receive them as they are for who they are. But it's already something, I consciously think about, and they're so young.
It's interesting you talk about that. Well, one, I love that example because, for example, my sister is several shades lighter than my brother and I. And so, one, people always assume that we were not siblings. Maybe a cousin, right? But not like actual siblings, actual sisters. And then if we say we're sisters, like, oh, well, maybe you have a different dad, or maybe you have a different mom. It's like, no, we have the same parents, same mother and the same father. But that's how genetics works, especially in communities of color.
Right.
Then thinking about my experiences with my sister, like, there are stories my mom has told about me around age 5, right? So very young, just a little bit older than your nephews, and how even at 5, I was articulating, like actually speaking observations about how people were responding to my sister differently than me.
Wow.
And I think in order to be able to say that, in order for my mom to hear me say, that's because she's light skinned, when my great aunts were like saying how my sister's going to be a heartbreaker one day, and, she's going to watch out for her because she's so pretty. And for me to be able to observe and name it as that, that means I had already observed it prior to then, right? I had already seen it enough times in my early childhood life to be able to put those pieces together at age 5. And so it does start young. And I find so often people really project onto babies, onto
Yes.
unborn babies, right? Like, oh, you're pregnant, right? And if you're a Black woman with a non-Black spouse or partner, for example, and you're pregnant together, people are like, oh, your baby's going to be so pretty. Or I hope they have hair like their dad. Or, I hope they have your eyes because your eyes are hazel or blue, right?
Yeah.
So people definitely project onto children their hangups and biases around beauty standards and worth and value and so many things.
And do you have any thoughts about like whether to talk about it with children or, because it's a really, yeah, and I think it's a really hard, there's a moment, in the film Passing, have you both seen the film Passing? That moment when the mother's like, don't talk to them about it. And it's like, well, it's clearly like, it's a really huge, this is the two sons in the film. Yeah, how do we navigate that? And like, I guess also checking, that the words that you're using are really empowering that small person and maybe making sure that they don't have to think about it if actually they don't want to.
So I definitely say talking to children about it is important. And some of my early research when I first started blogging, I was reading reports, from psychologists and stuff that even babies recognize differences in color and shading and hair texture and the shape of a person's hair, right? Like they recognize if the
Wow.
hair is a halo versus if the hair is like a long bunch of ropes or something like that. Like babies can see these shapes and these shades of color. And the important thing is, what is the emotional tone when they are exposed to these people of different shades and shapes, right? And they can by proxy, right? Like feel how the adults, how their caregivers feel about these
Yeah.
shapes and these colors and these sizes, right? And so I think it's important, just like if we're teaching children their ABCs, or teaching children their colors, or teaching children their shapes, their actual shapes, that these things are neutral, right? A square is no better than a triangle. The color
Yeah.
blue is no better than the color red, right? And so that these differences, we see them, and there's a neutrality in the observation of what's going on. And children will be able to pick up on, my mom gets afraid every time
Mm,
people come around, or my mom clutches her purse and like pulls me away and doesn't let me talk to these types of people, but she's always inviting other types of people to the house, and I have play dates with people who look like me but not with people who look like them. So they are very much more, even more than our explicit teaching, even more than our explicit conversations. I think children and young people are picking up on our sort of um, energy in general, right? Paying attention to how we actually act and behave, even about ourselves, right? Bell Hooks, may she rest in peace, talks about in a book called Sisters of the Yam how there was a Black mother trying to affirm her daughter's natural hair. And Bell Hooks was saying, right, but the mother was not able to demonstrate love for her own hair, right? And so while it's nice to tell your daughter, your hair is so pretty, but if you as the mom have not gotten to that place emotionally for
Yeah.
yourself, it's sending like a contradictory message to the child as well.
yes.
And so I think talking to children doesn't have to be like a lesson in the history of colorism, right? But we can definitely start with children really early and normalizing differences in skin tone, and normalizing and celebrating differences in hair textures and facial features. But I think one of the reasons why I often tell the story about me being 5 is that what adults have to realize is that children are already noticing that someone's
Yeah.
not speaking to
Yeah.
them the way they speak to their sister, or the way they speak to their brother, or the way they speak to their other classmates, right? Like a 5-year-old will notice if the teacher is playing favoritism. And so I think it's actually more detrimental if they feel like they can't talk about those observations, right? And so at the very least, just starting with questions, right? Like how does a teacher treat everyone in the class, and see what they say. if they are at a daycare center or, being going on a play date, right? Like, what do the kids say to each other? How do you all interact with each other? What's going on? And just listen to what they say, and they might, have
Right.
insights that
Yeah.
that blow our minds, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Just to pick up on what you were saying about your research, if people want to read and do some more diving in and kind of jump in and then like close the door and then snuggle up and get into some more magic and juicy richness, where can they do that? Where can they read more of your work, watch anything? Where can they access more of your knowledge and your offerings?
So the hub where you can access just about everything I've done is colorismhealing.com. And there you'll have access to all the blog posts I've written. You'll be able to find the sweatshirts if you want to like snuggle up with a sweatshirt or a t-shirt. And there are videos, so I include the videos with the blog posts. But I also have standalone books. So speaking of children, I have a children's workbook that I put out in 2018.
Amazing.
Yes. And there are other books that I'm actively putting out. So one thing that came out last week was a journal with writing prompts specifically about colorism. And I think that's
Ooh.
a really helpful resource, right? So over the years, I've written like prompts. And so I've compiled them all into one place in a colorism healing journal. And so again, doing that inner work of like really looking at ourselves and saying, where am I when it comes to this situation? I think things like the workbook or the journal and other resources like that will help a lot.
Lots of little fires make one big fire, right? Every individual doing the work.
Like that.
Yes.
So you're wearing a really nice jumper / sweatshirt / sweater. Could you tell the audience what it says?
Yes, it says, I see color and I love it. And so that is a direct response to people who say, I don't see color, oftentimes saying so in an effort to establish that they are not biased, that they are not racist, or they're not colorist. And my thinking around that is, but the color is not the problem. Seeing the color is not bad. It's our attitude about color. It's our attitude about difference. Difference is an inherently beautiful. I'll say, like, if you go to a garden and all of the flowers are the exact same color and shape and size, it's going to get boring pretty fast, right? And so we can appreciate that, oh, the variety of flowers and trees and, plants is what makes a garden so beautiful. And so difference is not inherently bad. It's about how you perceive and think about and feel about that difference.
So beautiful. And speaking of sweaters, and speaking of birthdays, we have one sweater / sweatshirt / jumper, depending where you are in the world. I think it's a sweatshirt. Amma thinks it's what do you think it is?
Jumper.
What do you think it is, Dr. Sarah Webb?
I call it a sweatshirt.
Okay, yes. 2 points for sweatshirt. Listeners, what do you think? We would love to hear your thoughts. Is it a sweater? Is it a sweatshirt? Or is it a jumper?
And so what is next for you, Dr. Sarah Webb? What is next on the horizon? Are there any like tidbits that you can throw our way that we can nibble on?
So I resigned from my full-time professor job at the University in Illinois, moved to New York, and am now committed to colorism healing full-time. So that's the overarching what's next, is that now I get to go all in and just focus exclusively on colorism healing. And one of the things I've been like sort of obsessing about all of last month is creating these journals and these workbooks and coloring books, right? So I'm doing like a affirmation coloring book for Black women, right? And so there are
Amazing.
coloring pages with affirmations on them that I'm writing and catering to Black women specifically. But I have like a whole list of ideas of similar types of things where people don't just have to listen to information on colorism. They can actually have like actions and activities and like projects that they can do to sort of infuse or support their journey. Yeah.
I love that.
I already know one person who I want to buy that colouring book for. I was like, me, and then I was like, oh, and also this person. So I'm excited for that.
My sister told me, she said, well, hurry up and do the children's coloring book next, because my niece and nephew are using it as well. Mm-hmm.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so important. And how about workshop? The workshop that I did was such a powerful, like the questions that you reflected and how I reflected back on my own family experiences, and it really was. So
Yeah.
do you have workshops for the public?
I do. So, well, yes and no. I have one-on-one coaching, and that's open to people of any race or color or gender. And then I have group coaching, so small group coaching, which is for dark-skinned women specifically. And then my workshops, I tend to allow people to ask me or invite me to do a workshop. It's been a long time since I hosted or curated a workshop just open to the public. So usually, like with the Mixed Bloom Room, there's already a group of people who are
Yeah.
kind of already together for a purpose, and then they bring me in for like as part of their series. So what I would say is that anyone who's interested in a workshop, if you are part of a school or you have a book club or you have an after school program or just like a church group or any sort of group of people that is interested in that workshop, they can email me, Sarah@colorismhealing.com. Yeah.
And I would really recommend it really strongly if you have a group out there and that you would like to do a workshop. That workshop was incredible. It blew my mind.
That's great feedback. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sarah Webb. I feel like we've just like shaved the tip of the iceberg off, but I feel like it's still a very rich and generous offering for our listeners, and you know where to go if you want more. All of the information is in our show notes as well. And who knows, in the future, we might be hosting a workshop with Dr. Sarah Webb when we do some IRL Power Up podcast magic. So just putting it out there.
I would definitely be down for that. Yes.
Choosing that for 2022/2023. Yeah. Yeah. And thank you so much for your wisdom.
Thank you.
I do feel like there's so much more I want to ask and but just we are so blessed to have you in this space celebrating our birthday with us.
Woohoo, happy birthday.
Thank you for listening. You can connect to us and our guests via the links in each episode's show notes. Before you go, we invite you to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of the goodness to come. And if you enjoyed today, perhaps tell a friend to tell a friend. We are always grateful for you, our listeners, for our fabulous guests, and to everyone who has contributed to and been a part of our journey here.
Our music is by Tomo Carter. Everything else is brought to you by us, the Power Up Power Team.
I'm Ella Mesmer.
I am Amma Rouge. And we are Power Up Podcast.